In the history of manned spaceflight, the first decade is hands down the most innovative, competitive, and dangerous. Both the United States and Soviet Union were developing new craft, breaking new ground, and trading spaceflight firsts back and forth throughout the 1960s. Despite all of these accomplishments, there was one that remained the ultimate goal for both nations, and that was landing the first man upon the surface of the moon. While the US was vocal in its project goals, spending the entire Gemini program developing the techniques to make Apollo work, the Soviet Union remained relatively quiet since its Voskhod 2 flight in 1965. Indeed, they were developing a brand new craft to accomplish the same lunar goals as its Apollo counterpart, but developments were kept very secretive, as the Soviet program traditionally was. While the Voskhod was essentially a modified Vostok, the same vehicle that sent Yuri Gagarin on his first ever human spaceflight, the new Soyuz was an entirely different animal and far more complex. A tri-modular craft built to be flown along with a translunar booster stage and a lunar landing craft. The Soyuz itself consisted not only of a manned descent module and an unmanned service and propulsion module, but a third orbital module that crew members could move into for orbital operations, experiments, and even serve as an internal airlock. The new Soyuz launch vehicle was essentially a modified version of the same R-7 that took Sputnik into orbit, with a more powerful third stage and improvements throughout. Indeed, the Soyuz launch stack would become, pound for pound, one of the most reliable and cost-efficient launch vehicles in manned spaceflight. The Soyuz spacecraft itself was another story, at least at the start of its lifespan. The first unmanned test flight was meant to be not only an all-up test of the new vehicle and launch stack, but also an unmanned rendezvous and docking test with a second craft, scheduled to launch one day later. While the first vehicle made orbit, the second was delayed, leaving the first to orbit alone until its maneuvering system malfunctioned, consuming all of its fuel and leaving it in an uncontrolled spin. It would take 2 days and 5 attempts to deorbit the out-of-control Hulk still in orbit, which had to be subsequently destroyed as its off-course reentry would have brought it down in China. During an attempt to launch the second craft again, only the core stage ignited, leaving the 4 strap-on boosters silent. The shutdown command was immediately triggered, and ground crews rushed in to drain the propellants from all 5 boosters. As this task was being completed, the launch escape tower suddenly fired, the exhaust overheating the propellant in the third stage, causing it to explode, destroying the launch vehicle and injuring several pad crew members, with 1 fatality. 2 months later, the third test flight reached orbit, and just like the first flight, began to suffer from a malfunctioning maneuvering system, causing excess fuel usage. Though the craft remained controllable, every attempted maneuver resulted in continued difficulties. The re-entry maneuver was also problematic, coming down far too steep, to the point that a hole had burnt through the heat shield, approximately 12 inches in diameter. This would have been lethal to any cosmonauts riding inside, but the re-entry craft still remained under control even as it came down hundreds of kilometers short of its landing zone, crashing through the ice of the frozen Aral Sea. Despite all these problems and not a single successful test, the craft was deemed good enough for the first manned flight. Several factors may have influenced this decision, ranging from the pressure to capitalize on America's Apollo 1 failure to ensuring continued victories in the space race, but primarily political pressure to set a record of space firsts on the anniversary of Vladimir Lenin's birthday. And just like Apollo, all of this caused procedures to be omitted, schedules to be rushed, and faults to be overlooked. Indeed, there were over 200 faults reported by engineers as the supposedly final Soyuz spacecraft was transported to the launch complex. This was one of 2 Soyuz spacecraft intended to be launched back-to-back, the first carrying a single cosmonaut into orbit, to later be the rendezvous target of a second Soyuz carrying a crew of 3, 2 of whom would perform an EVA to board Soyuz 1 for the return to Earth. This would make the list of spaceflight firsts to be not only the first successful flight of an intended translunar vehicle, but the first docking of 2 manned spacecraft, first 2-man EVA, and first crew transfer from one vehicle to another, externally at that, as the American Apollo was designed for all transfers to be strictly internal. In the commander's seat of the first Soyuz flight was Vladimir Komarov, veteran of the three-man Voskhod 1 flight. Ever by his side as backup was the most famous name in all of the program, if not all of spaceflight, Yuri Gagarin. And Gagarin was acutely aware of all the difficulties with this new craft, as well as the overwhelming pressures to proceed regardless of the danger. It was clear to him that the new craft was a death trap that would doubtlessly claim the life of anyone who rode it. But the Politburo would not be denied. They needed their political victory. Fortunate circumstance had helped the program before, and the intense secrecy had saved their political backsides when things went wrong. But there was one thing they would be unable to hide: the death of the national hero Yuri Gagarin. This was his trump card, to force the politicians to step back and truly examine the situation, while at the same time saving the life of his good friend Komarov. Gagarin would make an incredible effort to bump Komarov from the flight, putting himself in the pilot seat, knowing they would not take the risk if he were on board. It was indeed the perfect plan, were it not for one thing. Komarov knew the flight was doomed, but he was not so sure the flight would be scrubbed if Gagarin were on board. He refused every plea to step down, and overcame every effort to remove him, citing that Gagarin's life could not be risked. Komarov was going to be in the seat, no matter what. April 23, 1967, the new Soyuz vehicle takes to the sky with Komarov on board. Despite the explosion of the second Soyuz test, the launch escape system functioned properly, so even in the event of launch failure, Komarov's life would be spared. Further, as the craft performs all of its staging events and achieves orbit, the Soviet Union has now surpassed Apollo. The Politburo's gamble may have once again paid off. As long as the objectives are completed, any difficulties or failures could easily be shrouded behind secrecy, as the accomplishments are promoted worldwide, and on the birthday of communism's most celebrated leader no less. And sure enough, these problems would start right away. As Komarov triggers deployment of the craft's solar wings, one of the two refused to unfold. Troubleshooting did nothing, and the craft was left short on power for many of its onboard systems. After a few orbits, the orientation detectors started giving improper readings, complicating the craft's ability to hold position. By the 13th orbit, the automatic control system had failed completely. Worse, the manual system was malfunctioning as well, giving Komarov only partial control of his craft. Komarov would report on this, and it was clear the mission could not continue. Now, this presented a unique and interesting opportunity. Soyuz 2 was still ready to fly. While Komarov could not have performed the EVA transfer, as he did not have an EVA-rated spacesuit, the Soyuz 2 crew could still complete a rendezvous and attempt to free Soyuz 1's stuck solar wing. With the craft back under full power, it's possible the malfunctioning systems could at least be partially restored, and in this, a whole new level of prestige the Politburo did not expect. The first ever rescue and repair in space. Soyuz 2 sat on the pad in Baikonur, waiting for the launch window for rendezvous. But as night passes, heavy thunderstorms move through the area, and the booster's electrical systems were fried. Soyuz 2 could not launch. Komarov was alone, and one by one his systems were dying. There was no choice but to abort the mission, but serious doubts remained on whether or not the craft could make a controlled retrofire with its failed automatic systems and questionable manual controls. For 2 orbits, communication was even lost, and serious fears arose as to whether or not they could even re-establish contact. Komarov was on a one-way ticket toward oblivion. On the 15th orbit, contact was restored, and procedures immediately began for re-entry. Komarov had 2 orbits to attempt orientation and retrofire with the craft's ion engines, but the system failed, leaving only the manual system and one other big problem. The visor device used for manual orientation utilized the sun for direction, and in order to make the landing site in Orsk, the retrofire needed to occur on the nighttime side. The only way to accomplish this was to orient the craft on the daylight side and then hold the attitude manually by utilizing the gyroscopic instruments until the burn could be initiated. This left far too many things to go wrong, from the slightest misalignment, inaccurate engine timing, insufficient power, and unresponsive manual controls through the fiery reentry. He was promised that he would receive a hero's memorial, but Komarov made it clear he was not ready to die yet. He had a point to prove, and he was damn sure going to show the Politburo the consequences of their single-minded decisions. Soyuz 1 slipped out of radio contact, and the control team prepared to mourn their fallen hero. Their eyes focused on telemetry, and ears waiting for any sign of transmission, though many had resigned to the fact that contact would never be restored. But it was. Right on time, right on course. Through sheer will, determination, and pure pilot skill, Vladimir Komarov brought Soyuz 1 through re-entry, and he was alive and well. He overcame all the odds. The control center was no doubt drowning in deafening cheers as the drogue parachute deployed. Moments later, the main parachute compartment opens, and the wide canopy of material slips through, twisting above the craft and flapping in the air, and never unfolding. Soyuz 1 was barreling toward the ground, and the parachute would simply not comply. Recognizing the problem, Komarov triggered separation of the main chute, which successfully cut away. He followed by deploying the reserve chute, which immediately became entangled in the drogue, which did not cut away. According to Jamie Doran and Piers Bizani's 1998 book entitled Starman, U.S. listening posts in Turkey could overhear the final transmissions as Komarov was shouting in rage, quote, cursing at the people who put him in a botched spaceship, all the while saying final goodbyes to his wife. Historians are unable to adequately determine how much of this account was actually true or not, but what was absolutely and unfortunately true was that Soyuz 1 impacted the Earth at roughly 40 meters per second, 89 miles per hour, killing Vladimir Komarov on impact. The recovery helicopter arrived to see the craft laying on its side, bursting in flame and smoke. As the recovery crew approached, the soft landing rockets fired, having not deployed before impact. Just one final reminder of Murphy's Law in full effect. Despite their best efforts, the fire could not be put out as the craft's hull began to melt, finally leaving only the disintegrated remains smoldering on the ground as recovery forces watched in horror. They kept their promise. Komarov was given full state honors as a national hero, and Yuri Gagarin kept his promise, facing down the politicians with demands that safety never be sacrificed for their own selfish ambitions. Cosmonaut Alexei Leonov joined Gagarin in his efforts, both having known Komarov quite well, and both still having high hopes for the future of spaceflight. The Soyuz program was halted, and investigations began. Though many of the mission's faults could be traced to the numerous engineering issues clear before the flight, the most serious issue was the failed parachute. After the troubled re-entry of the third unmanned Soyuz test, the heat shield was enlarged and thickened. This increased weight of the descent stage, necessitating a much larger parachute. The containment pod, however, was not enlarged to carry it, and the life-saving canopy was forcefully stuffed into a space it had no right fitting into. If there was one positive to be taken from this incident, it was the fact that Soyuz 2 was unable to be launched, as it suffered from the same parachute defect. Had it launched, it is most likely that the 3 cosmonauts on board would have suffered the same fate as Komarov. On the other side of the world, NASA could not escape the irony. Both nations rushing toward the moon full steam, both stumbling at the same time, for practically the same reason. NASA expressed sympathies for their fellow test pilot, lost in the conquest of space. Vladimir Komarov's name would be honored alongside the 3 fallen astronauts of Apollo 1, their names etched into a memorial that sits upon the surface of the Moon, placed there by Neil Armstrong himself. Indeed, the dream of exploring space surpasses petty political borders. The lessons learned from these tragedies shaping the future, and those involved would never forget them. Soyuz 1 and its brave and talented pilot should never be forgotten, and his dedication and sacrifice will forever mark this week in space history.